All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Susanna Tuttle. I am the Director of Strategic Engagement at the North Carolina Council of Churches. And my favorite way to engage with all of you is through our Eco Justice Connection work. And we've been running these monthly forums, and I'm glad you're here today. So, as we get started with the Zoom meeting, you are invited to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're from, what group you're with. We also hope that you will use the chat to ask questions or make comments at any time throughout the event, because I will be doing my best to collect your comments during Analyah's presentation, and then I will ask our guest speakers your questions. So keep them coming throughout. And I'm going to be presenting a little bit today as well, so feel free to ask questions during that section. Since we started in February 2026, we have hosted speakers from the Carolinas Clean Energy Fund, North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, the Utility Fairness Now campaign, and today I am thrilled to be with my climate action colleague and dear friend, Analyah, to share her experience representing U.S. civil society at the historic international conference that took place in Santa Marta, Colombia last month during a time when many of us were doing lots of Earth Day activities. So the purpose of each month's Eco Justice Connection Advocacy Forum is to listen to and learn from our guest speakers and to explore education, inspiration, and mobilization opportunities for us as we all work together to protect the people and places that we love. And so many of you know me. I've been working with many of you for a very long time, almost over 15 years at the Council of Churches. And I wanted to take this opportunity to share a little bit about the local to global piece of the Eco Justice Connection work that we do. I've been very fortunate and supported by many people, both locally, nationally, and internationally, to be able to spend time in the international solidarity space. We have a section on our website that talks about the local to global connection. And so for those of you that haven't heard this presentation before, you'll get a little bit more of a taste of what we're leaning into here in North Carolina, and then also an opportunity for us to start the conversation, if it's a newer conversation, about what we can and should be doing in the spirit of international solidarity right here in our own homes. So I am going to start with a presentation that is always a little challenging when you're doing multiple things at once. Slideshow. There we go. So I am going, everybody can see that thumbs up. Great. Hopefully. Thanks for your help, Analyah, with the co-hosting. So one of the first things that came about our participation back when we were under the umbrella of Interfaith Power and Light here in North Carolina was that we became a member of the U.S. Climate Action Network in 2013. I was hired in 2011. I learned about the national network actually through our regional network, the Southeast Climate and Energy Network. And I recognized how important it was for our work to be connected to what was happening across the United States, and especially across the Southeast. And one of the requirements that I think is really, really a great example of leadership for a member organization to participate in U.S. Climate Action Network, or the acronym is US CAN, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but was for each of the member organizations, so in our case, the North Carolina Council of Churches, to design and develop and then lean into and check ourselves on what is known as a justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion statement, or in acronym known as a JEDI statement. And who doesn't want to be a Jedi? That's for sure. So we were more than willing and able to draft our commitment to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this still continues to be the touchstone of everything that we do through the Eco Justice Connection. And just here you can see on the slide, I'll just read briefly, we are working actively to become an anti-racist program of the North Carolina Council of Churches. We believe that relationships must be centered in justice and equity within the human framework, as well as with all of the natural world. We strive together toward this sacred goal, excuse me. And I look forward to talking to you more. If you go to our homepage, ejc.ncchurches.org, you'll see that you can click directly on the full statement. And it is a lifetime of work to live into what we have drafted for the North Carolina Council of Churches. So I look forward to talking to you more about that in the future. So as the next slide, this is our page that has our local to global connections. So I will send all the links out to you so that you can find this, who our partners are. We're really building this section out right now, but these little words on the screen say whether local to global, the climate crisis affects us all, yet the worst impacts of climate change often affect those who have contributed the least to its creation. Around the world, people are experiencing loss and damage due to the climate crisis, and we must stand in international solidarity. So that is what this presentation today is all about, a little taste of that. So I wanted to start where I got very interested about what happened historically relative to the development of what we refer to as the UN climate regime, or the United Nations framework on climate change, which is the acronym UNFCCC. Um, and this is a slide developed by the World Resources Institute that I've always found interesting. It's a little small. You really got to do a deep dive into these. But one of the things that I think is important as we're educating our neighbors, ourselves, and our congregations, our families, is that when you hear about the Kyoto Protocol, right? I mean, it's one thing to know about what actually took place there, and you can see mitigation targets and timetables for developed countries was agreed upon, or at least discussed. There was rules making that took place at the Marrakesh Accords. Then you have the Bali Action Plan. You get to Copenhagen. The birth of the NDCs. I'm going to talk about nationally determined contributions very briefly. But the big one up there is the green, where we get to COP21 in 2015, and that is the Paris Agreement. And so when you hear about the Paris Agreement, most people, if you're on this call, I'm sure you're familiar with it. Why is it called the Paris Agreement? Is because the agreement took place in Paris. So that is whenever you hear about the different locations of things happening, and we're going to talk today about the conference that happened last month in Santa Marta, Colombia, we often just refer to it as the Santa Marta Conference. So just wanted to give that reference point, and why the Paris Agreement was so critical to getting us to where we are today, and also what we have not met as far as the sustainability development goals that the United Nations has laid out for us in all of the different sectors, but specifically in climate, where we are failing on all of the commitments on a global scale at an increasing rate that is not only alarming, but an absolute crisis as of a kind that I don't like the word existential. I feel like it puts something out there that it doesn't feel like it's in here. But recognizing that the Paris Climate Agreement was put into place in 2015, and here we are in 2026, and we know that the United States is no longer participating in these negotiations. So we are at a moment of a great junction. So my personal passion point, and again, some of you have heard me give this presentation at length. I've gotten to preach it in different pulpits around the state. I've been on regional and national and international webinars talking about the U.S. Climate Fair Share. And the short of it is we have a whole website. Again, I'm going to give you these links. It's up on the left-hand corner as well. Is that in 2019, I went to a US Climate Action Network conference. It happened to be in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is not coincidental, I don't think, the fact that Analyah is here from Minnesota with us today. And I had never been given a presentation around climate fair shares that ultimately connects to what we refer to as global climate finance. And it was the keynote speaker. We were in the ballroom, hundreds of people, and there was a whole presentation given around global equitable climate finance. And then the very next breakout session that I went to was called From Bangladesh to Baltimore. And so it was the local to the global connection around what everyone needs to be doing relative to what our individual collective fair share is in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is what the climate Paris Agreement goals are and continue to be. And so um, it was very complicated. It was a lot of graphs and charts and numbers and people much smarter than me talking about things that I didn't understand. And as you know, my role in the climate movement, since I went to seminary and am now doing my doctoral program, is to help translate down what I refer to as the technacular into the vernacular. And so I got to work with the leading experts, designing what the numbers are, what the actual United States fair share is relative to the entire planet. And then once we knew that number, which is astronomical, we wanted to figure out the pillars, the three value pillars, as I refer to them. And the number one is we have the overall historic responsibility. We've released more global warming pollution than any other country, and we remain the world's second highest emitter. Actually, as India increases and numbers change, so does our responsibility. And what I like in working with young people and learning and hearing about how people are processing this and understanding this. There was a young, I think the person was 8 years old, and they said to me, "Yes, the very first Model T car that put out carbon emissions into the atmosphere, all of those emissions are still there." And I said, "You got it. That's it." And it's just building, 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 building. And the more that we um, show in action, the more we have the responsibility to our fair share numbers increase. And that second pillar of financial capacity, I think, is increasingly even more important. We are the world's wealthiest country with much of that wealth concentrated in an incredibly small elite. So from talked about a justice, equity, diversity, inclusion perspective, this isn't that all of us have to take all of our bank accounts and empty them out and start paying for the whole world to recover from climate change. This is about US civil society, all of us in this room, everybody that works at a company, everybody that works in government, to understand what the US climate fair share is as a whole, so then we can mobilize where the wealth is actually concentrated. And then for those of us, especially that identify as people of faith and conscience, the biggest why is because it's the right thing to do. We have moral and legal obligation to protect human rights, which are threatened by the climate emergency, not just human rights, land rights, indigenous rights. Every aspect of God's creation has rights, which is threatened by this. And if you saw in the news last week, the International League of International Justice Courts actually came together, and the UN, the majority of the UN countries, voted to support the International Court of Justice's declaration that every country on the planet has a moral and legal obligation to address the climate crisis. So lots of positive things are happening right now in response to the fact that lots of terrible things are happening simultaneously. So where are we at time? I don't know that I have time to show this whole video.
We're good.
Um, we are? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
yeah, yeah, I think it's helpful.
Okay, great. So, whoops. So, I'm very proud of this. As I got more and more involved in understanding those three value pillars and thinking about how we needed to communicate this to every single person in the US and beyond, and also be able to share with people outside of the United States that there's lots of us that know what the problem is, and we really want to do something about it. So I was able to work again with the leading experts around what the U.S. Climate Fair Share is. ActionAid USA is a huge part of that. Um, uh, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose the other team's names, but ActionAid in particular helped us connect with Climate Nexus, which is an amazing organization that unfortunately has also closed their doors due to a lot of circumstances in this new era that we're living in. But we co-wrote a script that then we designed into an educational video that could be shown to anyone at third grade level to talk about what the U.S. Climate Fair Share is. And I want to give a big shout out to the Southeast Climate and Energy Network that helped. I wrote a grant to help make sure that this could get produced. And so we are going to play it for you here. And this is our dear friend, Reverend Michael Malcolm, who many of you might know is the founder of the of the People's Justice Council, and who also is our narrator for the film and also hugely active in the Shift Us campaign that you're going to hear more about as well. He's also the environmental justice coordinator for the United Church of Christ nationally. Very busy man.
The world faces a wicked puzzle of a problem in climate change. Pollution from more than a century of fossil fuel use is heating the planet to a dangerous degree. There is no place to hide and no avoiding the fact. Humanity must fix this planetary crisis. But the key to solving this puzzle is doing it fast and in a just and equitable way. It's about countries and all the people in them doing their fair shares. Scientists have known for more than a century that carbon dioxide and other pollutants trap the sun's heat on Earth. The more we burn, the hotter the planet will get. But even though climate pollution is a global problem, some countries are responsible for a lot more pollution than others. Based on historical data, we know how much coal, oil, and gas countries have burned. It's this total amount of pollution added up over the years that's called historic emissions. This is the first part of figuring out a country's fair share in the global climate puzzle. The second part deals with each country's ability to contribute financially to solving the climate crisis. The amount of wealth a country has that could be put to these uses beyond meeting the basic needs of its poorest people is called its capacity to pay. Together, historic responsibility and capacity to pay give us a good sense of a country's fair share of the shared effort of solving the climate puzzle, and allows us to see different levels of responsibility when it comes to cleaning it up. While we're on the subject, we should also add that some people from each country, no matter how much or how little it's contributed to the climate puzzle, have a lot more responsibility and a lot more capacity to act than others. So how do the world's nations compare on these counts? First, the U.S., the richest country in existence, and the one with the most historic emissions, has the biggest fair share at 30% of the needed global effort. Europe comes in next at 26%. China has 12%. And India's fair share is about half of 1%. Mexico and all of the countries in Latin America together add up to 6%. And all the countries in Africa come to only 2%. The size of the U.S. fair share makes it especially important for the U.S. to do its part. And today, the U.S. is a long way from doing so. It will take all nations, each agreeing to and then doing their part to solve the climate crisis. So, what does a fair share approach mean in practice? International cooperation is key. And while money isn't everything, International climate finance is essential to climate justice. This is money that countries with the largest fair share, meaning the most historical responsibilities and greater abilities to pay, will put toward addressing the problem faced by the countries that emitted less and have less ability to pay. This money should not leave poor countries more in debt and must especially support the most vulnerable communities. Nations that earn the most by polluting the most will enable countries that contributed the least to adapt to the climate impacts they face. Climate finance allows two important things to happen. One, it pays for repairs and protection that will be necessary as climate impacts increase. And two, it allows communities to transition to cleaner energy sources. So, in places where we know climate change is killing crops, causing floods, and creating dangerous air pollution, climate finance will help the farmers adapt. It will protect people by rebuilding or raising their homes, replace dirty gasoline and diesel vehicles with clean electric vehicles, and invest in new clean energy sources. But there is one thing that climate finance is not. It is not charity. Now, charity is a beautiful thing. It is one of those things that people do out of generosity. But climate finance and a fair shares approach are both an ethical imperative and a political necessity. Justice is not optional. Not if we really intend to make a difference. Not if we really intend to change the systems that degrade us. Not if we really intend to do justice and equity. We must put planet and people over profit.
So thank you for watching that. It, we continue to want folks to have access to this. It's, as I mentioned before, something that very much the numbers change. So when it said 30%, that is our fair share, it's actually gone up significantly since this film was made. So continuing to be able to educate, inspire, mobilize, have the folks that are doing the scientific background, the Oakland Institute, the Stockholm Institute, these are the different groups that we're working with through the US Climate Action Network, as well as the ability to work through Climate Action Network International, of which the US Climate Action Network is our national node to Can International. So, can you let me know if we're back on the slide deck instead of somebody give me a thumbs up,
Yep,
maybe?
we are.
Great, perfect. So this is how I met Analyah. You're about to meet Analyah. And Analyah is going to tell us how she got into this as well, because here we are in Dubai at this point, bringing a letter to the White House on U.S. climate action. And with this, this is Analyah on the left, a dear friend, um, uh, Emily Carroll. Many of you know Green the Church, and this is Reverend Ambrose Carroll, and this is Reverend Emily Carroll on the right to me, who lives in Louisiana, and the young woman in between Analyah and I had these Fair Share Now, and I believe she was from I think Vietnam, and so we took a picture because we're all working on the same thing, and we hadn't even met each other. And the letter that we sent to the White House, and this is under the Biden administration. In September, this document was drafted in September 2024. We went to Dubai in late October, early November of 2024 for the climate negotiations. And you can see here I mentioned NDCs. When you go back to that chart where it talked about the different times when different pieces were brought into the many years of climate negotiations, this is now a requirement of all countries that are a part of the United Nations framework on climate change conferences, who signed on to the Paris Agreement, the US included. And so we decided to draft a civil society model for the United States submission to the United Nations because we knew that the government itself was not meeting the ambition that was required and agreed upon in Paris. So, this is an incredible document. You'll all receive a copy of it. I walked around with a printed spiral bound copy of it, explaining that from my perspective, it was the second most important document ever published on planet Earth, second only to Pope Francis's encyclical, and that always piqued interest. And now I need to read Pope Leo's encyclical on AI, but that's a whole nother conversation. So, anyhow, this is an incredible piece of work. I did not write it, people far smarter than I did. What I'm good at doing in Analyah is that we organize the people to get their stuff done and then put it into an actual document like we did with the video. So I fast forward into what happened at this last COP, which Analia is going to speak to, because what was getting really exciting in my field of work around ministry and ethics was the announcement that there would be a global ethical stocktake that would take place at COP 30. COP is Committee of Parties, for the most recent UN negotiations. And we are still following that. And I'm looking forward to providing some opportunities for all of us in this Zoom room and beyond to come together and do some mock trials of global ethical stock takes locally here in North Carolina, directly relative to the build out of Duke Energy's climate resource plan. This is where the local hits the ground to the global, is that if we're not doing our fair share in North Carolina in comparison to the rest of the states in the United States, then there's no way that the whole country can do their fair share. So I'd just like to have you all be thinking from the place of where you're sitting about what we're doing and talking about and making sure happens in North Carolina, because if that doesn't happen, then the whole world can't address the crisis. Um, so, yes, this is what I'm going to just fast forward. What happened in Belém in Brazil was very disappointing in that there was no mention of fossil fuels in the final agreement, or the final text, I should say. There was no agreement at COP 30 about much of anything. But the governments of Colombia and the Netherlands announced that they would co-host the first international conference on the just transition away from fossil fuels. And this is what we're here to talk about. So, this is what was going to happen. They started promoting it on the Fossil Fuel Treaty Network, and over a million endorsements of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative have already taken place. That was even before this first conference was happening. The North Carolina Council of Churches is a signator on this Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. And so, with that, we're going to hear about the progress. And I'm going to switch over and I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to bring Analia into the fold here and hand it over to you. As I mentioned to everybody, this is a dear friend of mine, my sister, my niece, my chosen family. I will follow this woman to the ends of the earth. And so, welcome, Analia, and introduce yourself, please, on the way only you can.
Sweet. Thank you so much, Auntie Susanna. Yeah, so really, really honored and excited to talk with you all, and thanks for being patient with me. I'm was telling Susanna I am filled to the gills right now with debriefs on Santa Marta and preparation for Bonn and the SBs, another UNFCCC UN event that I leave for next week. And so this life is a crazy one, but I'll just start a little bit by introducing myself and telling you guys a bit of background and how I came How I came to be. Again, my name is Analyah Schlaeger dos Santos. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. I am born and raised in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on Dakota and Anishinaabe land. I'm currently at my office in South Minneapolis right now. I grew up in North Minneapolis, and North Minneapolis is the highest concentration of Black and Brown people in the state and the highest asthma rate. And so I come into this not from a scientific background or a policy background. But really, I taught swimming for 14 years before getting into this from the time I was a kid until, I've started doing more organizing at a national and international scale. So um, the first thing I thought of when I got into climate justice spaces was how do I communicate what I learned from teaching people how to swim into climate justice organizing. Those things are not necessarily intrinsically connected, right? But I realized that I got good at working with people's relationship to their environment. And so I come into this from the perspective of, how do we influence right relation? And I say that, not as like a theme, but as a consistent guiding question that I don't think that we as a global society have figured out yet. And so I get the honor and privilege of being in organizing spaces along with the brilliant Susanna and some really amazing other folks. But I came into this through youth organizing. So I was hired by Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light in 2019 to create a summer camp on energy efficiency, which quickly grew into an environmental justice leadership program, which then grew into a year-round apprenticeship modeled program for youth. So I come into all of these conversations from a perspective of healing relation, and naming that that is one of the only ways that we're going to get through what is being tasked of us as a global society, and from training young people. So, it's really important to me that we as adults, and I'm a young adult yet, and I have a lot to learn. And, we constantly say that youth are our future, and we have to make a better world for them. And a lot of our elders have left us not a world that's not doing so well. It's in hospice, it feels like. Um, and I believe that we have to protect the next 7 generations, and we can talk about the future generations till the end of days, but if we don't focus on making it better right now and addressing things that have happened historically and harms that continue to be expounded upon, then what are we really doing here? Um, so that's how I come into this space. So, skipping forward a bit, I have been our U.S. CAN, as Susanna said, U.S. Climate Action Network. I have been our liaison for my org since 2019, and I've been in this work for 7 years, going on 8 years. And so I started to get more into national and international climate justice organizing spaces a few years ago, but I feel like in a lot of circumstances, I'm still new to all of this. And yes, I have been to 5 COPs, or the Conference of Parties. And the other day, somebody called me a COP veteran, and I was like, I rebuke that. First of all, I planned on COP in Brazil being my last one, and yet I'm preparing for the COP this year and COP next year already. So, um, I come into this work from a perspective of trying to make this understandable. I think that in at all levels of climate conversations, aside from discussing what it looks like and educating our communities, um, a lot of this goes miles above all of our head. And so, one thing that's really important for me is making all of these very complicated topics understandable. So I actually got into Fair Share's work, I believe in 2022, maybe for the very first time. And joined the leadership team for the US Fair Share's work. I think 2023, Susanna. My days are blurring at this point, but I think 2023. Um, and we, some, like Susanna said, some really brilliant people who are real good with numbers and figures and all of those things that my brain does not function in that way. Disclaimer. I do the people part. I came into this in leadership on US fair shares and kind of hit the ground running. So I got the honor of working alongside and learning alongside some really brilliant folks, including Susanna, um, and starting to understand what it really looks like for us to have a conversation, at the very least, about how we do our fair share as US civil society and as people operating in living in the country that has the highest historical emissions and the largest capacity to pay. And we also have many lived realities here, as we all know, that, a lot of folks in communities like mine did not contribute to the climate crisis, and yet we are bearing the brunt of it. It's women, it's folks of color, it's youth that are bearing the absolute brunt of the climate crisis. And that is not a discussion topic to debate. It's really, that is the reality. We are affected the first and the worst, and yet we are tasked with addressing these impacts in as many ways that we can while also coming out of hopefully survival mode. And so, a lot of my focus has been really how do we address community members and how do we make the local to global connection, because it's so hard to consider what's happening down the street from your home, let alone on the other side of the world when you're in survival mode or you don't know where your next meal is going to come from. And that's a really difficult reality that is a serious barrier among many barriers for participation. Um, so the more I've learned about all of these conversations, and I think in 2023 was my third COP, and where I would start to learn about concepts such as loss and damage. And I don't know, Suzanne, if you're down to just put like a little descriptor of loss and damage in the chat, but essentially at the UNFCCC, and we live in the world of acronyms, so forgive me, I'll try to define them as I'm going. But at the United Nations level, there are three focuses: adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. So the way I describe it to, for example, college students is we can adapt as much as we can. Adaptation only goes so far when countries like ours and other countries, polluting countries and large corporations and billionaires, this is not my opinion, this is the reality. They are continuing to drive the climate crisis and other crises, right? Um, so there's conversations on how we can adapt. What does that actually look like, adaptation? Mitigation. How do we stop how do we stop more harm from being caused? How do we put the pause on what is being done so that we can move forward in a good way and hopefully have some chance of survival, right? But then also that third one is a newer concept of loss and damage. How do we start to conceptualize and put numbers behind, and it's a finance conversation, but how do we put numbers and figures behind the damages that have been done to communities? You could put a dollar sign on how much it costs to replace a whole neighborhood, right? You could put a dollar sign or, values-based understanding on, what sea level rise has done to this community. You can put a dollar sign or, a chart on emissions and how that affects asthma. We have all of the information at our fingertips. But loss and damage actually goes a step further and starts to consider how can we hope to cover loss of culture? How can we hope to start to cover damages that have been done that have taken indigenous lands? How do we even hope to put a number on a loss of language or a loss of life? You don't put a dollar sign on how much people's lives cost, and yet some of these powers that be have put us all down to a number, right? So in reality, loss and damage is a conversation on reparations. And when we talk about climate finance at all levels, it is a conversation on reparations. Fair shares is a conversation on reparations. Now, it is an expanded conversation and an attempt to address the need for repair. And reparations is a big scary. It's a big one that, it's terrifying to get into. There's so many different understandings. There's so many different ways, like especially for Black folks in the US and in the Americas. Um, some of the powers that be will never cede money and land back to Indigenous peoples and Black folks for what's been done to us. And some of these conversations at the United Nations level is an attempt to get into how we repair harms done historically and presently, because the harm of colonialism and colonization is ongoing. So, um, as of right now, in addition to some of those other spaces, I'm the Environmental Justice Youth Program Director, and I'm the Global Climate Justice Coordinator with Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, and I co-chair the International Action Team with US CAN. I'm one of the lead organizers for Climate Reparations Camp. So I am in too many organizations and I have my ear and my foot in too many doors. And yet, my goal right now is to make it so that we understand what it looks like to do our fair share and we actually get into the steps needed to discuss and make action on how we repair harm. And so for the US Fair Shares work now, we are called Shift Us, and I lead Shift Us. Susanna's among our leadership team for that. And so the impetus for this campaign initiative way of being was that if you refer back to what Susanna was naming about the NDCs, the Nationally Determined Contribution, we have had the material on what it looks like for countries to do their fair share for a while. We have the information available. We can make an action plan and make what do you call it, a SMART goal, and make the thing happen. But for countries that have done the most, it would call for our countries to name that they've really messed up over a long time. And they've really caused a lot of harm and they continue to cause harm. And as we know, some of the powers that be and some folks around us will never admit that. The Catholic Church is starting to, in some spaces, admit that harm has been done, but that's one entity, right? Um, and so for years, there has been a conversation on loss and damage. There's been a conversation on provision of finance. There has been a conversation on countries should do the right thing. I am actually deciding to stop using the word should because this COP process, there's been 31 almost of these. This a little fact that I like to spew whenever I can is that this conference of parties and I are the same age. We're twins. The first COP ended a couple hours after I was born. And so for my entire life, there's been an attempt to address the climate crisis. And we have done nothing. We have done nothing. We have talked about what countries should do till we're blue in the face. Um, and it's disappointing as a young person. It's disappointing as a community member. Our representatives, and for the US as one example, come into this space and say, well, it's too hard for us to do our fair share. We make too much money, and we also don't have the money, and we don't have political will. So, frankly, they're lying because we do have the money. We've shown that we can mobilize X amount of money to terrorize our neighbors. And again, I'm in Minneapolis, so we've been dealing with the brunt of what's been going on to our immigrant relatives, for the last few months and beyond. But like we have shown as a country that we can mobilize money and send it to a different country to cause harm. We have mobilized money and sent it to terrorize our neighbors in an instant without congressional approval. So we have the money. We can pay for these things that we have already signed on to do. And their other thing that they say is that we don't have the political will. And so a lot of brilliant people put in work to creating an NDC document, and then we can present the NDC document to our representatives to use as negotiating tools, right? But then when we go back home to the US, the general public is not a part of this conversation. So Shift Us was born out of the US Fair Share's work because the work has been done to create the policy document. How do we make the people understand what's being asked of us? And that is the real challenge. That is the thing that we haven't quite figured out yet, and we're trying to figure out how to attack that at every possible level. If the people know what to care about, and I don't mean pushing an agenda, I mean that the whole world is asking for us in the global north to do our fair share. So, when the US participates in the United Nations spaces, we hold up progress. And now that we're not participating, we're doing the opposite of, well, the opposite of holding up progress would be contributing to progress, I suppose. So we're not doing that, but we're not helping the situation right now. And we owe the most time, care, attention, support to this task. So, it's a little bit of context and just storytelling about kind of the why. So, I get the honor of leading the Shift Us work right now, and it's really a focus on how can we have a conversation on its reparations, but also just on harm repair. What is our responsibility as a local to global? Because the same way that our communities are treated and upheld and honored or attacked here locally is the same way that our country and other countries like ours treat communities globally, and that can't keep happening. It can't keep happening. We don't have time. We don't have time to have yet another year of conferences to discuss doing the right thing when nobody's forcing anyone to be accountable. So that's my rant. But I'm going to connect it to this conference that just happened, just looking at the time. So I just came back from Colombia. Again, Susanna will tell y'all my life is insane. And I say that when people ask how I am, my only answer is ridiculous because it's a ridiculous life. So I got back from Colombia about a week and a half ago. Next week I go to Germany for the SBs. Um, because this conference came out of the repeated failure of the COP process. Again, there's been 30 of them, and we still haven't gotten the thing done. In the final text in Belém, we did not really discuss fossil fuels as being the main driver. So what we just experienced was the first conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels, which is a huge deal. It was a historic happening. Those of us that were there loved, I've been hearing everyone say it was an experience. Maybe that's the Midwest in me being like, there were so many bad parts and so many good parts. But the fact of the matter is this thing happened for the first time to actually discuss the meat and bones of why we're there, which is brilliant. And it brought, I think like 57 countries um from everywhere to be a part of what's called the Coalition of the Willing. It is necessary to name the US is not going to be a part of the Coalition of the Willing. And so this conference was, yes, a historic happening. Yes, it was very well executed, and also there's so much that we have to learn from it. So I'm just going to focus on kind of the top level things because I think you can get into the weeds about what came out of this conference, but um, a couple necessary things to name were that um, it was in Santa Marta, Colombia, yes, and um, it was co-hosted by the Netherlands and the government of Colombia. There were so many issues with this process. One of the main issues, there was hardly any representation from a lot of global South countries. A lot of African and Asian nations did not get their visas approved, and that is not just a random unfortunate happenstance. That is because of racism and classism, etc., etc. Certain governments were supposed to sign off on people's visas so that they could participate. They happened to let certain countries' visa applications sit on their desk. So that's a very necessary thing to name when we look at new processes, right? This is a new process. Um, we do not have the option to not make sure that everyone's at the table, especially those that are affected the worst by this. Another thing to name is I got the privilege of being a delegate with the first delegation of Afro descendants in any international climate for whatsoever. That is both a really sobering fact and it was a blessing. It was really exciting to be a part of, an 11-person delegation that's chosen from Afro-descendant communities globally. And we have had to hit the ground running. We don't have a constituency at the United Nations level formally. And so, you know, to be there in service of that, was really awesome. Okay, just looking at the time and I'm yapping. But so the most important things that came out were that that we are working on a just transition. It's already happening. What does that look like? The second is that there was a People's Summit declaration, which I can make sure that Susanna has so that you can all look at it.
Just drop
That
that in
was
the chat.
collectively contributed to by I think 1,000+ organizations, and some of us were up till midnight on Saturday night synthesizing everyone's inputs. And I kind of rage typed some things into there that got directly approved, which felt great. But that means there's more work for us. So, one of those things was fair shares, that countries will be doing their fair share. And it needs political will to do so. And that reparations is included all up and down in the People's Summit Declaration. And then I included Afro descendants everywhere where indigenous peoples are named. So we are to be considered as the same sort of groups and communities that have been impacted by systems of oppression and harm the most, and that whatever happens next, it is imperative to include our presence and guidance on. One of the biggest things they announced was that the second conference will be happening next year in Tuvalu. It's an island near Australia. It will be hosted by Tuvalu in Ireland. And so that's a big deal. We don't know when it's going to be. We don't know what we're going to discuss, but hopefully we're moving towards the actual discussion of fossil fuel phase out treaty. Um, and so those couple things were some of the biggest things that came out of this conference. But if I can leave you guys with anything, I just want everyone to pay attention to this next iteration, because as we move towards a treaty, then we have some sort of standard for where we have to be. And that is treaty is the bare minimum. And then we work from that beyond there. And then also that if we know that our government, whoever is leading it, is not going to be part of the coalition of the willing for something like a treaty on a phase out of the thing that is causing the climate crisis and other crises, we as the people have to be prepared to live out what it means to do our fair share. And so, everywhere you can, when you're having conversations on what your local impact looks like, I am imploring everyone to draw a global connection. When we're discussing how we cover our community and how we address certain harms that are being caused, I want you to draw a global connection. This is what the rest of the world is asking of us, y'all. They are asking for us to do our fair share and for the people to catch up because our government, whoever leads it, it hasn't mattered. We don't do our fair share. And so, what does it actually look like for us to not only dream the world that's possible, but recognize that that world is like one dimension away and that we can actualize it? It just means that we have to have a little bit of abundance mindset and operate as though we already have these things within our reach and we already have the solutions as presented to us by communities globally. Um, okay, so I'm just gonna stop right there because I recognize we only have a couple minutes left and hand it back over to you, Susanna.
Well, Analia, I could listen to you talk forever, and I also want to be able to, recognize that this is such a big conversation, and so our ability to um, take all of this in is actually a lifelong journey that we're on together. So I just want to really applaud everyone who was able to join us in person today, because hopefully you don't ever want to not talk about this moving forward. That's how I feel about it. And as we find our brothers and sisters globally, I recently was able to go to Brazil, and when I was there, recognized that my brothers and sisters in South America identify as Americans. Mexicans are Americans. Canadians are Americans. Uh, you know, uh, People living in Peru are Americans. And it's just such an expansive way to love our neighbors as ourselves, and really protect our brothers and sisters and how we can come together. And so when I asked Analia to come on, and she is so very busy, thank you, thank you, thank you. I also just dropped into the chat that Analia is going to be a part of a panel that the Institute for Policy Studies is leading on Thursday evening. So the registration is there. And I also will get this recording out as soon as possible so that you can have all the links that I shared, including the slide deck, the video. We ran out of time, y'all. There's another video, a 3-minute video that I'm going to include at the end. And if any of you want to stay on after the 5 o'clock hour, I will play it because it's just 3 minutes and it is an invitation to go to part two of what happened in Santa Marta. But I also want to honor everyone's time here. And we are not going to have an eco justice forum in June because I will be traveling. But I'm also really interested in hearing what all of you are interested in learning more about. As I said, we've gone through a lot of different topics, and the goal is to bring initiation and inspiration, and then this call to action that Analia just shared with us, that goes deep, deep into our hearts and spirits around always having a local to global context because we live on a planet. And I often talk about, in the words of Thomas Berry, what it might be like for all of human species to re-indigenize ourselves to this earth. So with that, thank you. If you need to leave, Analia, if you need to leave, I am just going to close this out with this last video, and then I will send the recording out, as I said. Let me get to the right page before I do that. But again, thank you, thank you, thank you, everyone. And Analia, any last words while I get my act together to share this video? Here I go. Now I'm
No, I
ready.
just appreciate you so much, Susanna. Thank you for hosting this space. I'm so honored. I would put my email in the chat, but it is closed for collaboration, and I say that with love and care. But
Everyone, please email me and again, yeah, this is what it's like to have my own sister on the my niece on the show.
I
So
love you, buddy. Thank you
um
so much,
love
everyone.
you. Thank you. And here is the next call to action from our friends that pulled together the very first fossil fuel treaty conference.
The world has darkened of late by the clouds of war, injustice, and rising seas. A sickness now spreads that envelops all within its grasp, to the ultimate desolation of species once numerous and known. We have forgotten that we belong to one another. Yet, a solitary beacon burns bright at the far edge of the map, far from the grand cities of the American giant and the ancient castles and splendor of Europe. There lies a vast blue continent, more ocean than land, more tide than border, more memory than monument. Far from places that have long held power, from structures who have steered us deeper into the storm, stands a lighthouse for humankind. Here, the horizon is not an end but a promise. Here, the pulse of the earth is still felt in the turning of the currents, in the breath of reefs, in the stories of old carried by wind and wave. Tuvalu, where the ocean is both cradle and thread, where a promise of a new world is kindled and where hope now gathers. Not in towers of glass or halls of empire, but on fragile ground that knows what is truly at stake. From this place of spirit as vast as the Moana grows a defiance that will not be drowned, where we will quiet the engines of fire and guard the Eden bequeathed to us by God Almighty.
We fight with all our breath not to sink beneath the waves because we choose life. Life over extraction, futures over profit, people over power. We choose life for our children we have yet come to know. For the earth that will one day will receive our bodies. To replenish the world upon which they will grow. So let the world come to listen, to reckon, to change. For here, where the tides are rising, our will to resist rises higher. Here, our one, we make our stand. For if we save the Pacific, we most definitely will save the world.
Thank you again. And that is our next opportunity. So let's here in North Carolina think about how we can be involved. And I'd love to have a working group around this, whatever people are called to. But this is our time, and this is what gives me hope is all of you. And so may it be so. Go in peace, and we will see you again in July. Take care, everybody. Bye.